So now let's talk about how do you go about thinking about developing a cohesive compensation strategy. At the beginning, when companies are small, basically comp strategy tends to be one of two extremes. Either you're going to have everybody on a salary, or you're going to have most people on some sort of an incentive plan. In standalone freight brokers, it's very common for them to be on 100% commission type plans where they have cradle to grave brokers. That's much less common inside an asset-based carrier because you're not likely to be able to hire some of the roles that you're going to need to hire for safety and maintenance and everything if you put them on variable compensation. So what I more likely see when I'm dealing with asset-based companies that even have added on a brokerage is it tends to be more the other extreme, which is everybody is more salary-based or they have an hourly wage and they don't do a whole lot from incentive compensation perspective. So it's interesting to me just within this industry, you can have two very different types of organizations that start from either extreme. Sometimes brokers will start to add on assets, sometimes asset companies will add on brokerages, and then you can end up with this clash between these two extremes. The answer, as in most things in life, is that the best choice is someplace in the middle on this. You want to have a little bit of incentive compensation design layered in on top of a good salary structure as well. So as companies start to move and evolve into the growth phase, things start to change a little bit in terms of how they think about compensation. It's not so much now what they can afford to pay, but are they paying enough to get the talent that they need? Are they hitting a market competitive wage? That's where salary surveys really start to become very handy because then you can see what are my competitors paying for this. You guys are all aware, I'm sure, of some surveys that exist in terms of driver compensation. You need to do the same thing with your other employees as well to make sure you're getting the right talent from a recruiter standpoint, from your accounting department standpoint. And then once you get to be what is a market leader, and so in this world that would probably be about 300 million or so in terms of revenue, you really need to be thinking about having more sophisticated compensation management. So here's where you would be doing performance review systems, you would think about having salary bands, and you would really be managing your people in that way. So that now compensation really becomes a strategic tool for you to use to grow your business. Okay, one of the things that's really interesting about trucking companies, asset-based trucking companies, is that all of the roles are really interconnected. It's very hard for you to do one thing and not another. So one of the earliest projects that I did that was specifically trucking only was for drivers. Boy, talk about getting thrown into the deep end of this industry. It was Conway Truckload before they were acquired by XPO, before they went back to being CFI. So it was in that space there when they were Conway Truckload. And they wanted to revamp their driver compensation plan. And so a critical lesson, we had put in tiers for them, for the drivers to be able to get more if they exceeded a weekly mileage, right? This is not rocket science. That's what you guys need them to do, right? You need to get your drivers over, whether the number is 2,200 or 2,350 or 2,500, whatever that number is. You guys know there's a point where you're going to break even on that truck, and you need to get the drivers to get to that point. So what I always say is, from a compensation perspective, tell me what you want them to do, and we will figure out a way to pay them to do that, right? So if you need them to drive 2,300 miles a week, then we have to figure out a way to pay them to drive 2,300 miles a week. And it can be as simple as putting in a little half-cent kicker when they get there, right? So we rolled this out to the drivers, and the very first thing that they said was, why is my driver manager going to want this to happen? I know what's going to happen. I'm going to end up, the number was 2,300. I'm going to end up at $22.99 every single week because my driver manager is going to stop me short. And I went, what? They just spent a whole lot of time and money for me to figure out how to do this to get you to 2,300, and you think that they're going to deliberately stop you from getting there? You know, it was so illogical, but it registered with me at that point that it's like, this really is very interconnected. And so now when I'm doing those kind of projects, I almost always say, look, we got to talk about how your driver managers are paid as well. Because if I could have said to those drivers, Your driver manager also gets a bonus when you get to 2,300. I think we would have had a very different conversation. So you got to make sure you're thinking about how everything is interconnected. And it can even get down into your fleet operations, into your maintenance department, right? Are you encouraging them to make sure that those trucks are getting on the road, back on the road, and are being repaired in a way that makes it so that the drivers don't have to come back in again? Everybody really does work together. This is a lot to digest, and it's really hard to do this all at once. It takes a lot of time and energy and a lot of focus from you guys to pull it off. So there is a preferred order that you can tackle this in if you want to go that route. If you feel like you need to eat the elephant one bite at a time rather than all at once. So I would say start with driver sourcing. So that would be your recruiters in your training department, your orientation group. Start with them. Then you want to think about driver retention and fleet operations. Think about those guys. Then drivers. Okay, so you want to make sure that you've got those three things first and up and running, and you know exactly how they're going to be compensated before you start really thinking about rolling out a new plan for your drivers. Hard to think about them without each other, because you have to make sure however you're going to be compensating your drivers, that these guys are going to support that. Then you can go into customer sourcing. So then you can think about how are you directing your sales staff to try to get the type of freight that you're going to need to have, make sure it fits in your network, that's going to keep your drivers on the road, as much as we've now said we need them to be on the road for these planes. And then asset management, so maintenance and safety. Lastly would be your back office support. So there are companies out there, I'm sure you guys are all well aware, that Prime has incentive compensation for everybody in their organization. And that includes accounting. Is anybody in here from Prime? Am I right or am I wrong?
You're right.
Okay. So that includes accounting, IT, HR, pretty much everybody.
Includes the people that clean the offices.
Everybody.
Everybody.
Yeah. Which, God bless you for doing that. It doesn't work for everybody because you have to really have a cultural, like it's in their DNA that they set up their plans that way, and everybody just operates in that kind of a system. I would say if you're starting out with this and you don't have it already, like sort of baked into your DNA that everybody in the organization is going to be on an incentive plan, I would leave your back office support staff to last. My experience has been that they tend to be a lot of work for not a whole lot of return in terms of what you get for them, because they're not as directly impactful on the bottom line personally. They may be very well impactful. Obviously, your accounting department has a lot to do with collecting your money, but it's really hard to track them from an individual basis to be able to really get at what that person is doing. And so I've worked with some companies where they want to pay basically on a number of bills processed, right? Think about the amount of work that you have to go into tracking that for what you're actually paying for that person, and is it really going to make that much of a difference in terms of their pay, right? In terms of their work. So you're not going to be able to put that many dollars to it, and it's not going to drive that much difference. So that's not to say it can't be done. It can. I have done plans for accounting and HR, IT, marketing, those kinds of roles, but it would be the last thing that I would consider. Shifting for a minute to think about brokerage. Okay, so when you think about that world, there's typically 3 essential functions that have to happen however you have those roles organized. You've got to have somebody that's responsible for bringing in a new customer. So I usually color that role green. You have to have somebody who's responsible for taking care of a customer once you have brought them in. And then you have to have somebody who's responsible for negotiating with the trucks. Okay, so green, blue, and red are the colors that I use to help brokers kind of figure out how their jobs are organized. Until recently, I didn't really think there was as much of a mishmash on the asset side of things, but I have come to be enlightened that you can have, if you think about translating these roles into the asset side, you can have a fleet manager, you can have a load planner, and you can have a customer service rep. And those roles can be just as combined, right? You could have one person theoretically doing all 3 of those things, depending on how you have your office organized. or you could have them all be as completely separate siloed functions. So you can take some of this concept and think about how you might apply it to your operations on the asset side of things to get more role clarity. Generally speaking, effort follows focus. And so if you're telling somebody they have to do 3 things all the time, the best you're going to get out of them is 2 really well, okay? So you really want to think about, is there a way that you can create more focus throughout your organization by splitting apart some of these roles and having them be a little bit more siloed in terms of their thinking from a function perspective. So from a brokerage perspective, you know, a cradle to grave broker would have all 3 colors combined into one role, or the full split model would have them be all fully separated. So you would have 3 different people doing each one of these things. There's also a difference when you think about the type of customer that you have. So there's spot market brokerage, which is probably less of what you guys have than you would have contracted accounts. Okay, so most often, and I'll ask for a show of hands here, from a brokerage perspective, how often are your brokers dealing with just solely spot market, where they have nothing to do with the asset side? No hand, a couple, 1, okay. Mostly what I've seen is that they are in some way connected to the asset. So they're either taking overflow freight that your trucks can't move, or they are a source for your assets to go and look for loads that might actually help fill in a backhaul or a hole that you guys have in your network. So how many of you have it more where that's the function, where brokerage is more like a, it takes loads from overflow and it becomes a source? Yeah. So chances are you have a very different discussion with your brokers when you're giving them a load that is from one of your asset customers. The choice here is not to try to gouge them, right? The choice is probably to move that load, and they may be moving at a loss because there's a reason why it fell off of your trucks, and you now have to have your brokerage group do it. So that's going to be a different type of customer arrangement. And if you think about the types of resources that you want to be working on that, they're going to be different. You're not going to want somebody who's like I'm not going to pick on anyone in particular, but pick 3 letters of the alphabet and put them together and call that a brokerage. Any one of those 3-letter brokerages that exist out there that you guys probably all will get, well, you definitely will get calls from, but I get calls from them after a show like this where they argue with me about my freight, and I'm like, I don't have any freight. Are you sure? Yeah, really sure. I don't have any freight. You don't want one of those people dealing with your long-term asset-based customers. So you're going to have a different profile and a different skill set for the type of people you're going to put inside your brokerage. Probably going to be much more the types that are used to dealing with bigger, more complex accounts and have a bigger customer service focus. Once you get all the way over to your project or your fixed rate accounts, then it's like 3PL or transportation management services, TMS, then you're probably going to be looking at something that's even very different there. So here you're going to have somebody who needs to be a big dog outside salesperson who can go and sell a 3 or 5 year contract. You need a project manager who can do quarterly business reviews and go sit down with the leaders of that organization and speak intelligently to them about what's going on with their freight. And from a carrier side, you probably mostly need a project coordinator, almost like a traffic manager, somebody who can just make sure things are happening. Design compensation plans for those roles first, and then think about the leaders above them and the support people below them. So typically you always want to start with your core roles. So on the asset side, in your operations group, the core roles are going to be your load planners, your driver managers, and your customer service reps. Whatever titles you use for those roles. That's the core asset side of things. This is the core on the brokerage side of things, and there's some interesting parallels between them. Then think about your team leaders. Then think about your supervisors. Then think about, do you have people that are doing your after hours support, right? Those will come after you design the first set of plans. The upshot of this from a brokerage perspective is that you would compensate these roles differently, right? And I think everybody can kind of get this intuitively. If you think about somebody who's an inside sales rep whose job is just to get on the phone and try to get one load from somebody, versus somebody who's going out and negotiating a 5-year contract that is going to be dealing with all modes that you offer, right? You are not going to put somebody straight out of college into that meeting with potentially one of your biggest customers to try to sell them all of your modes of service. You just need a different person to do that. And so you are going to pay them very differently. The spot market inside sales reps in the brokerage world are probably making about $55,000 a year, maybe, depending on where you are in the world. That's kind of the Chicago rate these days. If you're talking about an outside sales rep selling truckload services, you're probably talking salary of maybe $80,000 and target total comp where I tack on incentive on top of that. We may be pushing 125 to 150, right? Maybe even more. So it's a very different labor market that you are going after, and you're going to be compensating them very differently. So one of the mistakes that a lot of companies make is they take too broad of a brush over all of these roles, and they think, well, one size fits all. I'm just going to come up with the same approach for everybody, and then that's going to work. It doesn't. You really have to think about what you want your roles to do differently. Some sample org structures from the brokerage world in terms of how these guys typically organize themselves. And all of these can work. It just depends on how you want your brokers to operate, and you have to be aware of some pitfalls that come along with them. So a lot of standalone brokers will start as the cradle to grave model, and I could see that actually being something that might get started inside a trucking company as well, because you hire one person to start your brokerage operation, and so that person probably is not going to have a whole lot of the green function. I see a lot of lack of green. So green is the hunting. Green is going after new customers. Tends to be when you're starting up a brokerage inside an asset company, you're going to focus on customer service and finding carriers. You're not going to necessarily need that person so much to go out and hunt for new customers that are going to be just brokerage customers. So that tends to be something that comes after a couple years in terms of the evolution. And then you go, oh gosh, you know, there could be a business here where we could really be going after more brokerage customers, but we don't have anybody who knows how to do that. They're really good at customer service and finding trucks, but they really don't know how to hunt, okay? So chances are what you will see is a lot of blue-red and not so much green. One of the ways that people will solve that is they will say, okay, well, maybe we need to take some work off of that person so that now they can have time to hunt, right? So they've gotten too bogged down with doing existing customer management, doing these clerical functions, order entry, track and trace, all that kind of stuff. So we need to peel some of that off and have them, now they'll have the ability to go out and do some new cold calling that they haven't done before. So that's where you see the pod world start to develop, where you start to put support resources under that person who's the top dog broker, and that helps that broker grow. There are a lot of big brokers that are built off this kind of a structure, and that is where you will see some astronomical pay rates if the brokerage hasn't adjusted the pay rate for that person at the top. Because now this person, oh boy, that was not what I wanted to do. Hold on, we'll see if I can fix it real quick. I hit escape. I got it back. Yay! Okay. If they don't fix it and recognize that now the productivity that that person can do has gone way through the roof because of these support resources, and if they're still paying them a 25 or 30% commission, their pay is going to go like this, right? And there are a lot out there. I personally have seen it and can attest to it, that there are definitely brokers in this world, that top row there, where they make over $1 million in W-2 a year. I've seen it, it's real. It's not recommended, but it does exist. Okay, then we can get over to the split model, which is, they call that sometimes the Chicago model. It's built off of American backhaulers and Coyote and Command. They all did that this way, where they said, look, there's something to be said for the Industrial Revolution. It actually made things work. We got efficiencies out of it, so we're gonna split up the two functions, and we're gonna have a customer function and a carrier function. And each side is going to get really good at what they do, and by doing that, we're able to going to get more throughput through the system, and guess what? It works. So a number of very successful Chicago brokers have been built off of this model, and in fact have done the splits even further, where they'll start to split up now the hunter from the farmer side. They'll have a customer operations team that provides some support, and they all operate as completely separate functions from one another. All of these models can work. They just have different strengths and weaknesses and different cultural implications to them as well. So if you're over on the left side of the page where you're dealing with more of a cradle to grave or a pod, it's going to be much more about the individual, right? You're much more likely to have that individual broker calling the shots, and you are more likely to lose some connection with those customers, because now that customer is going to be perceived as belonging to that broker that has the account. In the split model, you have less risk of that, because now you have multiple different parties touching that customer. So that is a much safer approach if you're worried about potentially what could happen if, even if it's nothing nefarious, even if it's not that the broker is deciding to take your business, but if they just simply, decide to not work for you anymore, or they have an accident, or they get sick, you want to make sure that you've got some other connections within your company that can talk to that customer. So the split model tends to lend itself to that a little bit better. It does require more technology though. It requires more communication, because now you've got one side that's booking the load and another side that has to find the truck that can meet the requirements for that load. Often you need a good technology system in between those two to make sure that the information is being passed from one to the other efficiently. For you guys that have brokerages in here, which ones of you have the cradle to grave model? Split model? Or some sort of pod structure? Some pods going on? Anybody have something they really love and they want to share? You guys are sleepy. It's after lunch. I need to wake you up a little bit. Anybody want to share something? You love it, you hate it, war story. Oh my God, I would never do this again story. All right, think of something, and then I'll come back to you at the end. All right, so now let's think about, what do you need to do to develop your compensation plans? There's definitely some steps that you want to follow. You need to think about what it is you're trying to solve. This is not necessarily a fun or easy undertaking to go through. It can cause some significant upheaval in the organization. Compensation is pretty daggone personal, and people don't like to have their compensation messed with. So even when I'm rolling out plans where they didn't have any incentive before, we're not reducing their base salary, and we're adding in a quarterly incentive for them, right? You'd think that would be the best day, like they'd be like, oh my gosh, this is so awesome, this is wonderful. I still have people that get upset by that. And it's like, we're giving you more money. Why are you upset by this? But some people just don't like the scrutiny, right? They may be a perfectly good worker. It doesn't mean that they're doing anything wrong. It just means they don't want somebody to be tracking them. They don't want to feel like they're going to be held accountable on a scorecard. There's just some part of the population that they operate that way. I don't really understand that, because I was always one of those people that it's like, if you told me here's the scorecard for what I have to do, it's like, okay, I'm going to go through all of that and check them all off as quickly as I possibly can. That's just how I'm oriented. But some people aren't. So you have to be aware of that as you go through this, that there will be some people in your organization, I don't care how good the incentive plan is, there will be somebody that will be upset, okay? So you have to understand why it is you're making this change, and what is it that you are hoping to get out of it. And you better have your whole leadership team be behind that and to be committed to it, because there's going to be some point where somebody's going to be upset. You can't have one of your leaders backing down on it. You have to be committed to making this change. Clarify your roles. So what are your accountabilities? What are your expectations? That's where that org design work comes in. If you look at your org chart and you put all those colors on it and you see a bunch of rainbows all over the place, it may be you have a role clarity problem. And there may be some places where you could actually pull some of those things apart and get a little bit better role clarity and more efficiency by having more solid color boxes rather than rainbow boxes. There may be some parts of your organization where you just have to have that, where you have to have that rainbow orientation because of the type of freight you're dealing with. But others of them, you can maybe leverage some efficiency by splitting them. What are the desired pay levels? Do you have a strong benefits package or not? Do people want to come to your company because of reputation, or are you having to overcome some reputational limitations? Maybe they just don't know about you. You need to think about those kinds of things when deciding how much money you need to offer for these roles. Select your performance measures, okay? So 3 to 4 KPIs that make sense. There are lots of KPIs for this industry. I've got like 3 columns worth of lists of KPIs that you can use for fleet managers or driver managers. It can be revenue per truck per week. It can be revenue per mile. It can be empty miles, it can be empty backhauls, it can be driver retention, and that's just the first 5 that I can come up with off the top of my head. It can be total revenue. There's so many different things that you can do. Chances are you already track it. If it matters to you from a business perspective, you probably are already tracking it or can do it very quickly. Those are going to be the kinds of things you're going to want to put in your incentive plan. You shouldn't be inventing something completely new that you've never looked at before. So think about what you have that you can drill down to an individual level, and that's what you're going to want to use for your compensation plan. Then mechanics. This is where the fun stuff comes in, and I'm going to save some of this for when I go through the examples, because then you can see what some of the mechanical choices are for you. Model the plans, test them. Okay, you cannot roll out a compensation plan if you haven't tested it. You have to know who's going to be happy and who's going to be sad, because they're not all going to be happy. If everybody's happy, guess what? You're overpaying. So that's not a good outcome either, because then you're not going to be happy a year from now. So you want to make sure that you've got good balance. So one of the first things that I always want to do is I want to look at historical pay. Look at the last 2 years of what people have actually been paid, and then compare that to what you're going to be telling them is their target incentive under the new plan. Are they going to see that number and they're going to go, okay, it's about the same as what I made last year, maybe $1,000 more, $1,000 less, okay, that's fine, I can live with that. Or are they going to see a big difference, right? Are they going to see something that's way more than what they've ever gotten in the past? Or are they going to see something that's $20,000 less? Because I can tell you the one that sees a number that's $20,000 less, you're going to have a conversation with that person. And it's better if you have a conversation with that person before you are rolling out the compensation plan to the group that they're in. Because otherwise you're going to look back and that person's face is going to be white. And they're going to go, wait a minute, I'm taking a $20,000 hit, this isn't going to work for me. You need to know that before you have that conversation. And so you can do a base salary adjustment if you need to, or you can let them know that there's some special case that's going to be done for them, or that you expect them to be not performing at target, that they are going to be one of your excellent performers, and at excellence they will make as much money as they did in the past, right? Need to get in front of that. You also need to understand what it's going to do to your company. You need to have a sense of the aggregate cost impact here. You need to communicate them. Communicate them, communicate them, communicate them, and then communicate them 15 more times. There is no limit to the amount of times you can or should be communicating your compensation plans. These things are typically fairly complex and need reinforcement. So what I'm talking about here are not straight commission plans. There's going to be something in there that's going to be a different way to think about it. People are scared of math. It's a shame about our country, but it's just we don't teach math in a way that makes people comfortable with it. They always feel like they're not good at it. And that's usually not true, right? Usually they have more facility with math than they realize, but they're afraid they're going to be put on the spot and they're not going to understand how to calculate quota, percentage of quota. You just have to show them. Get out the calculator and say, this is how you do it, right? Just walk them through it time and time again. Reinforce the plans, and then evaluate the plan effectiveness. So if you do this, anytime you're changing something about your compensation plan, follow these steps and you'll have a much better outcome. Okay, so now we're going to go through each bit in a little bit more detail. So amount of pay, that's called target total cash. So how much do you want to pay at target performance? How much should be fixed and how much should be variable? So the fixed portion is going to be their salary or their hourly rate, wage, whichever way you want to think about it, or you have it applied to your roles, which that's one of those legal things. I don't give legal advice in terms of who should be exempt or non-exempt from overtime, but there are rules about that, so you want to make sure you're paying appropriately. The amount of upside for top performers. Then the pay elements. Then you want to think of what are you going to measure. There are rules for what you should measure. It's got to be objective, measurable, relevant, controllable. The scope of measurement. Are you measuring at the individual team or company level? When does it count? The relative performance of each, the mechanics, such as performance period, pay frequency, is it a commission, etc. Okay. Once you've got your things split out, you're going to allocate your weights across these different elements. And that's one of the fun parts of this, is you realize you can do more than one thing. You can have two things that somebody is paid for, and that gives you balance. It gives you the opportunity to say they have an individual and a team component. They They have a financial and a strategic component. It may be for driver managers, you may want revenue per mile and driver retention. Okay, that's an example of two different things. One's financial, one's strategic, though you could argue driver retention is also financial, right? Maybe you measure the first, revenue per mile, at the individual level, and you measure driver retention at the company or team level. Okay, so you can do both of those things. Maybe you pay revenue per mile on a monthly basis, and you pay driver retention on a quarterly basis. So now we have short-term and longer-term focus. And all I've done is I just created two parts of the plan. So now we have a conversation. We say, let's just say theoretically that we want that driver manager to be paid $10,000 a year in incentive. What weight do we want on revenue per mile, and what weight do we want on driver retention? Is it 50-50, 60-40, 70-30, right? That's a discussion for you guys to have with your leadership team about what's important to you. What matters the most, right? They both matter, but which one is a little bit more important than the other? Which one does the individual have more control over than the other? Driver retention, there's a whole lot of that they don't control. So maybe we're not going to have that be the primary element in the plan, but we want it to be a good secondary element. FMCSA scores. You might want to have your driver manager be tied to FMCSA scores. Again, there's a whole lot about that they don't control. So we're not going to put 100% of their incentive pay tied to something that they don't control. I mentioned this already. Good performance measure selection is critical. You need to have things that are relevant, so it matters to the company. You could conceivably track how many bags of garbage are taken out. Doesn't really matter, though I guess it could if somebody stopped doing it, but it's not going to directly impact your bottom line. You want things that are relevant to the company, controllable by the individual, and anytime there are a lot of things that are sort of controllable, like I said, driver retention, FMCSA scores, safety, even driver miles. Right? When we're talking about a driver manager, there's only so much a driver manager can do. They're working through that driver to get the result. So anytime you have a less impact from a controllability standpoint, you've got to back down how much weight you're putting on that piece in the plan. Objective. Avoid subjectivity as much as possible. People do not like incentive plans if they feel that it's all based on whether or not my manager likes me. It needs to be something that they know for sure. If they do X, they will get Y. Got to be very clear and measurable. Like I said, if you're not already measuring it, chances are it's not important to you. You want to stick with things that you actually have in your systems now. The other thing that gives you is historical data. You've got to be able to test your plans using historical data. So if you're starting out with something you haven't measured in the past, you're going to be behind the eight ball in terms of using that in your incentive compensation plan. Use goals and expectations. So you need to tell people what good looks like. Very often, and this is more so on the brokerage side than it is on the asset side, companies will pay transactionally. So they'll pay a percentage of every load. That's not giving anybody an idea what good looks like, right? If I'm getting 5% off of every load that I move as a broker, I'm going to back into how much money I want to make. So I'm going to say, this is how much I want to make in a year. I'm going to divide that by 0.05, and that's how much gross margin I need to do, okay? That may or may not have any connection to what you as a leader want them to do. You need to tell them what good looks like. So something needs to change. Something needs to happen in the incentive plan that says, when you get to this level, typically I use 3 levels, threshold, target, and excellence. There's a threshold level below which no incentive pay is earned, and if you stay at that level for too long, guess what? You might not have a job. So below threshold, not good. Threshold, you're okay. Threshold to target. Target is where we want you to be. That is where we are paying our market competitive wage for you. Excellence would be above target. Your 1 in 10 performer should be at excellence, okay? And that's where they're going to get maybe 2 to 3 times their target incentive amount. You need to find those levels for them so that they understand, okay, I'm between threshold and target. That's not great. I need to get my way up to target. Now I'm above target, but what's above that? How many of you guys are in loyalty programs? Airlines, hotels, rental cars? Come on, you guys all travel. There, thank you. You are all awake still. How many loyalty programs have you ever known that have 1 level? How many do they typically have? 3, 4, 5. Supposedly Marriott's going to add something above Ambassador Elite. I'm Ambassador Elite right now, so I don't know what's going to be above Ambassador Elite. But there's a reason why they do that. It's because we're all oriented to want to have something else to strive for. So you have to keep giving them something else to look at. And if all you're doing is paying them a straight commission, where it's just 5% of the gross margin in perpetuity, that's a bit like winning a pie eating contest and the prize is a pie. It's just more of the same, right? You need something to be different. Something needs to change. Otherwise, they're just going to be like, you know what, it's just not worth it. It's not worth it for me to stay late to just get the same thing that I got before. But if I get to a certain level and my commission rate now goes up to 8% or 10%, maybe I'll stick around for that, right? Because it's something different. All right, more is not a goal. I get that a lot. Leaders will say, well, if my employees want to make more money, they should just sell more. More is not a goal. You have to be explicit. All right, mechanics are about control. So even though you think, if you're using a straight commission plan, you may think you have a lot of economic control. You actually have very little. Because if you don't set that commission rate right at the beginning, now you're stuck. How many of you have commission rates out there for your brokers where you're paying them 5% of gross margin, 10% of gross margin, something like that? You ever tried to change that rate? Do you think it would go over well if you, Yep. It does not go over well. How many of you have goal-based plans out there? Maybe for your sales force. It may not be for your brokers, but a goal-based plan would be you hit $1 million in sales and we're going to pay you $10,000. That's a goal-based incentive plan. Anybody have a goal-based plan out there? If you change the goal next year and tell them they have a 20% increase, now they have to do 1.2. Is that too much of a problem?
All depends if they're hitting it already.
If they're able to do it or not, right?
Then they have to maintain.
You can change goals much more easily than you can change commission rates. People accept that goals are going to go up. They don't accept that commission rates are going to drop. Even though mathematically I could give you a scenario where it is exactly the same financial outcome either way. It's just a weird way our brains are wired. Okay, so straight commission plans have the least amount of control. You can add production tiers to get a little bit more control. You can do a matrix. I've got some samples of that I'll show you in a second. In all of those, pay is a function of volume. Volume is the determining factor. Most control would be completely individualized objectives where you had MBOs. That's like, and this is common in this world for sales reps. I need you to go sell something that will fill a backhaul for us from South Carolina back to Wisconsin. And if you do that, I'm going to pay you $2,500 when we get this much business out of it. That's an MBO, right? It's a very specific, targeted objective. Think about the degree of control that you now have over what you are getting and what you are paying for what you are getting. That is the ultimate in control. One level in from that would be person level goals. Then standard role and level goals. So by role in the organization, they all are expected to do $20,000 a month if they're a broker one. These are based on the market value of the job and the value of the service that they are delivering. In the middle, you can in fact do goal-based commissions. All right, I'm going to skip this because I want to get into some of the examples for you guys. Like I said, there's way more in here than I can cover off in an hour and 15 minutes. There's different timing in terms of paying people. You don't have to do it all monthly. You can do quarterly. You can do quarterly with a year-end true-up. Now some sample designs, because this will make everything start to come into place for you. So this is a sample matrix. Matrices are incredibly flexible from a design perspective because there's so many different things you can do with them. This one shows, this would be for a broker. This one, whoop, I keep hitting that escape button. I want to point, and it's not my pointer. Is that my pointer? There's my pointer. It's on the bottom. Okay. So this shows gross margin dollars, monthly, presumably monthly gross margin dollars, though it could be quarterly conceivably. And then gross margin percentage, and the place in the middle, that would be target. That's where they want to be. That's where you want them to be. And they get 5% of the gross margin, so in this case they'd get $1,500 if they did $30,000 and they landed right smack in the middle. Up in the upper right-hand corner would be considered excellence. So if they're doing $60,000 a month and 22% in gross margin percentage, they would get 12.5%. What you can do with a matrix is really unlimited. You can phrase it as a percentage of goal. You can have one of the axes be individual and one be team. You can also pay as a percentage of a target incentive. You don't have to pay a commission rate. You can, but you don't have to. You can say, instead we're going to say your target incentive is $1,000 a month, and if you hit right in the middle, you're going to get 100% of the 1,000. If you hit up here, you're going to get 200% of the 1,000, so you would get $2,000. And now you see how you've retained that economic control over the relationship between production and pay. So you're setting the goal, and you're deciding what the payout is when they get to that goal. Those things aren't linked by a commission rate. Once you've put that commission rate out there, like I had on that other slide, that 5%, you've now abdicated control to that mathematical formula. This kind of approach lets you maintain control. You can have a matrix that shows a flat payout in the middle. If you want to make it so they don't have to get out a calculator, this is an easy way to do it, right? So you just say, this is your volume, this is your margin percentage, find the intersection of the two, and that's how much you got paid this month. So it's really, really simple. Okay. You can also do some other types of things. So these are what I call secondary metrics. You can do a tiered metric. I often do something like this for employee development. It basically gets at team leaders to make sure that they are coaching all of their employees up to a certain level. So you would want them to get 60% of their employees at or above quota for them to get this payout. This usually sits next to a financial component. Do a lot of these when, especially for your back office roles. So like accounting, HR, IT, this is a way to consolidate a bunch of KPIs that in and of themselves, they don't really drive that much. But if you look at all of these things combined, they show that somebody is doing a good job. So these are going to be things like processing accuracy, time to bill, lots of stuff like that typically goes into these kinds of scorecards. Bounties are fun for anybody that has new customer acquisition requirements. So if you want somebody to go out and get new customers, putting a bounty on getting a new customer is a really good way to do that. You pay it when a particular thing happens. So they've gotten a new customer and the new customer has gotten to 5 loads and $1,500. When that happens, maybe you're going to pay them $500 at that point that they hit that level. It's not an ongoing thing, right? So they might get counted for any additional ongoing revenue or margin from that customer, might be in some other part of their plan, but they got that bounty, that one-time payout for going and getting that new customer. The way I usually figure out if that's important to a client or not is I will ask them a question. I say, you get $1 million in business from this sales rep. Theoretically, it's a sales rep. And they do it with one customer. One customer gives you $1 million, or you have 10 customers that bring you 100,000. Which do you want? If the answer is the second one, then you want to pay bounties, right? Because if you're paying a commission or anything that's based on your goal, based on $1 million, the rep doesn't care how they get it. And the easiest thing for them to do is find one big whale, right? Go get that whale and land it. Hey, I hit my goal, I hit my $1 million, but that's not really what you wanted as a strategic outcome. So if you want the 10 customers, you need to figure out some way that the rep isn't going to make as much money by just doing it with one big whale. So that's when you do bounties. All right, sometimes not all customers are equal, so sometimes bounties get a little bit complex.
I have a question on the bounties. You kind of put like a time frame on it, like the first 90 days?
Typically it's within 6 to 12 months, depending on how big of like the first load shipped. So it depends on how, like, do you want a big customer or a small customer? Do you want repeat freight from a customer? I've had some where they'll pay the bounty when they've had 5 loads 3 months in a row, right? So they don't want to pay it for 15 loads that all came in 1 month because maybe it was a project, but they want to see that repeat freight. So it really comes down to what it is that you want. There's also typically, you will say a new customer is somebody that has not done business with you in the last 12 to 18 months. I start with 12, and then the minute somebody says, well, what about our California, I say 18. Because if it's a seasonal shipper, right, we can't always be sure that the produce is going to come out of California at the same time. So then we go to 18 months, and then it usually, we aren't going to, because we don't want to pay bounties just because the seasonal shipper came back around again, and this year it was 13 months instead of 12. All right, so when you do a bounty that to get at different sizes of customers or different types of freight, so if you've got a van division and a flatbed division, you may want to pay different amounts for bringing in a customer in each of those divisions. You may have a strategic focus on really wanting to build up your van or your intermodal, right? So you may want to put a juicier bounty out there for those things to get the attention and focus on it. It's malleable, so you can change this over time. What you have as a bounty for this year doesn't have to be the same for next year. And if you started to get some sense of how these metrics work and how the mechanics work, you'll see, even if you imagine going back to the matrix, right? You can change those corners. You can change what's measured on one axis. And your people aren't going to feel like you've just upended the whole thing on them, right? They're like, oh, we just changed the strategic focus. Now we're not doing gross margin percentage this year, we're doing load count. What year was that? 2018, right? We all needed to shift to load count from a brokerage perspective, then gross margin percentage because the rates went through the roof. This year, it's a different story, right? But that gives you, having that flexibility in your comp design gives you the ability to change your plan to adjust.
So what typically do you find is a reaction when you make that change on an annual basis with those that are eligible for the bonuses? Because that change, I think some people just like to have something normal and consistent that they understand and can count on, and when you're changing that as that variable, does that create some?
See my first statement that like basically anytime you change compensation plans, it's not going to be easy.
Right.
But if you set the expectation from the get-go that this is a strategic tool that we're going to be using to run this business, right? Our strategy is not going to be the same 5 years from now that it is right now. And that we should be looking at this compensation plan and tweaking it every single year to make sure that it's driving you guys and the company where we need the company to go. So you set that expectation with them and they just know, hey, I'm going to get a comp plan change. But I think a lot of it, we're very visual creatures, right? And so it's like if we see something that looks the same, right? It's the matrix and it's got all the same colors and there's one thing about it that has changed. It's not going to feel as traumatic to us as if, you know, you're going from something that was one construct and now, you know, we were paying 100% commission and now we're going to do salary plus a goal-based incentive. You know, it's like changing complete constructs is really hard for people. So the way I describe basically what I do in the toolkit that I provide is it's just that. It's a toolkit. It's not a thing, you know, it's not buying a compensation plan. It's buying a methodology and thinking about how you now have in this box a variety of different tools that you can use and you know how to use, and you can turn the lever on one and you can decide to not use one of the other tools and you can pick up something else as you need to drive your business where you need it to go. Unfortunately, that comes along with some complexity. I'm not going to go into the bank. That's really more for hunters in the brokerage world. I want to show you some sample trucking plans as well. So this would be like an overview page that I typically would show to an employee to say how their plan works. So in this case, and all these numbers are made up. They're, you know, not necessarily representing anything. But they have a $13,500 annual target incentive split into two pieces: revenue per truck and driver retention. 70% weight on revenue per truck and 30% weight on driver retention. Gives you details about how it's paid. Then typically, I would go into each one of those elements and explain the mechanics of how it works. This is a matrix used for a CSR. So booked loads versus goal and percentage of booked loads delivered, because I'm sure you guys could shoot holes through it immediately if all it was booked loads versus goal, right? If you want a CSR, if you tell them to book a lot of loads, what are you going to get? A lot of loads booked. You might not move any of them. So you have to have a balance out there, which is one of the things the matrix is good for, is it forces you to create that balance. So we also said, we also want to see how many of those book loads actually get delivered. Recruiter, this one basically works on a funnel methodology, so in terms of closes relative to the number of leads that you have, applications relative to the number of leads, closes relative to the number of applications, and then ultimately your 30-day retention for those drivers. So this is an example of a KPI table where it's kind of those things, any one of those things by themselves doesn't tell the whole picture. You have to kind of put all of them together, and then when you can see how that recruiter is managing that funnel, now you get a much better sense of if they're doing a good job. Ultimately, this ends up giving you a score down here that tells them how much of their incentive they're going to get. Dispatcher, or driver manager, depending on what you want to call it. So this would be an example of a driver retention table and a miles per truck per week. These are both tiered incentives. You can do these on a matrix. You can do revenue per mile. You can do gross margin per mile. There's so many different things. Safety department. I promised you some little oddball ones. I had to block out some of the stuff on here to protect the innocent. So for safety, scorecards. So cameras, accidents, speeding, unsafe driving, drug testing. Again, using that sort of KPI table framework. And then if you want to get really fancy, this is a project that I did probably now 5-6 years ago for Pride. It was a lot of fun doing this, and I had at the time had a great graphic designer on my team who was able to put this together into this super little scorecard thing. But the way this worked is actually the drivers were able to basically give themselves raises. They accumulated points, and every time they got to 10,000 points, they got another ½ cent per mile or something like that in terms of their base rate. And the way they accumulated points was based on, if I can read it here, miles, MPG, and on-time service were the things that helped them accumulate points.